My name's Sara Savage and I'm going to be your host tonight. I'm a writer, editor, broadcaster and producer and host of the Parallel Lines radio show on Triple R on Wednesday mornings, covering arts, culture, design and science. And I'm really thrilled to have been asked here tonight by Open House Melbourne as part of their What Would Jane Do program, which I'll get to in a moment. I will just take this opportunity to quickly remind you that Open House Melbourne, their weekend is taking place this weekend, in which over 200 buildings around Melbourne will be open to the public. So if you want to find out more about that and head along, you can go to openhousemelbourne.org. But before anything else, I should probably introduce these three wonderful ladies next to me, and then we can dive into talking about the self-made city. So immediately to my left, we have Mimi Zeiger. Mimi is a Los Angeles-based critic, editor and curator, and her work is situated at the intersection of architecture and media cultures. She's covered art, architecture, urbanism and design for a number of publications, including the New York Times, Domus, Architectural Review and Architect, where she is a contributing editor. She's a regular opinion columnist for Dezeen and the former West Coast editor of the Architect's newspaper. Mimi's a recipient of the 2015 Bradford Williams Medal for Excellence in Writing about Landscape Architecture and is also the author of a number of books, including one published last year entitled Tiny Houses in the City. And we're really pleased to have Mimi here all the way from LA.
Thank you.
In the middle, we have Jessica Christiansen-Franks. Jessica is an urban designer and social entrepreneur who has dedicated her career to understanding the social dynamics of urbanisation. With experience in Australia, the UK, Canada, India, Vietnam and the Philippines, Jessica has advised public and private sectors as well as major international aid agencies. Jessica is a program advisor at Co-Design Studio, helping to steer Australia's largest community-led placemaking initiative called the Neighbourhood Project. She's also co-founder and CEO of Neighbourlytics, a social analytics platform for neighbourhood development, which I'm sure we'll chat about at some point this evening. And at the end we have Millie Cattlin. Millie is a Melbourne-based architect who is co-director of These Are the Projects We Do Together, one of my favourite practice names, I have to say, and a practice that she runs with her partner Joseph Norster. Their practice is committed to developing experimental ideas in the fields of art, architecture and education through the design and ongoing operation of three key projects: Testing Grounds, Siteworks and The Quarry. So I think we can all agree we have some pretty wonderful voices on the panel tonight. This discussion will go till about 7 o'clock and then we'll have 15 minutes for audience questions. So please get thinking during the discussion if there's anything you would like to ask any of the speakers about anything we discuss tonight or anything else. So tonight we are looking at the self-made city. And that's actually borrowing a term from Christian Ring, the Berlin-based architect, curator and author who published a book of the same name in 2013, I think it was. And that book explores the self-determined design of spaces and their impact on the quality of urban development. And we'll be doing a little bit of that ourselves tonight and looking at citizen-led and unorthodox city-making that could improve the lives of city dwellers in meaningful ways. And of course we'll be speaking to these themes as well in the context of these three speakers and each of their practices and experience as well. So I promise I'll stop talking soon. But just quickly, I did mention earlier that this talk is part of the Open House Melbourne program, What Would Jane Do? Inspired by Jane Jacobs, the American urbanist and city activist, and a journalist who last year would have celebrated her 100th birthday. This isn't a panel about Jane Jacobs and about her life. If you do want to find out more about that, it's a pretty amazing story. There's a lot to catch up on, but you can catch the short season of documentary Citizen Jane: Battle for the City, which is running at ACME until next Thursday. So this is not a panel about Jane Jacobs and her life, but this is an event inspired by the work of Jane Jacobs, who you could say more than anything is known for being outspoken on matters of city life and urban planning. and being outspoken against, I guess, so-called rationalist planners like Robert Moses, whose, I guess, infamously austere approach to planning in the 50s and 60s in particular resulted in the isolation of communities and displacement of people, dead-end streets, separation of residential and work uses. I feel like that's putting it quite nicely. And in 1961, Jane Jacobs published The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is, I suppose, her seminal text, and a critique of that kind of particular kind of planning policy. And that book she's pretty well remembered for. So even though this isn't a panel explicitly about Jane Jacobs, she is the basis for some of our discussion tonight. So I thought that maybe a nice place for us to start would be by asking the three of you what influence, if any, we'll accept all answers, good or bad, Jane Jacobs has had on you and your work. I don't know who wants to start.
I guess since I'm right here, I'll start. I would say that the work of Jane Jacobs has been sort of washed over me, although I can't say I really absorbed it per se. But her work also was very influential on people whose work has been influential on me. People like Ada Louise Huxtable, who was the New York Times critic in the 60s to 80s, who wrote about sort of the importance of sort of people within the architectural discussion. So I think her work was very influential there, and then also folks like Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, who coming from the same sort of references of Herbert Gans and a questioning of the modernist principles that were developed by SIAM, the Congress on International, blah, 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 at the time. So it was sort of the counter-positioning of architecture to the social good, I think it's been very important for me.
I'm sure. Well, I know this from reading your columns over the years. Jessica, how about you?
Look, I must admit I'm an urban designer, and I studied landscape architecture first and then urban design, and the thing that I am the most inspired by Jane is that she wasn't actually trained in town planning or urban design, and she is absolutely, without question, one of the most influential town planning thinkers of her generation and now our generation. And so I think, what I've learned through my 17 years of working is, I spent a long time trying to learn the rules and learn, I didn't quite understand how if we're trying to create vibrant communities, we have to do the building this height and the rendering this colour and the articulation at this level, and that didn't quite connect for me. And so I spent a lot of my career trying to learn the rules so I could then apply them and make better places. And I ended up in a role where I was giving expert evidence at VCAT, at the Planning Tribunal here in Victoria, and I remember being struck at a moment where we're all sitting around the table. It was in a moderation session, and there's maybe 11 people there, several $1,000s an hour around that table, and we're arguing about whether the balustrading should be clear or opaque. I'm like, seriously? Is this seriously how we make good cities? And so I think what inspires me about Jane, and there are many others like her as well, who have been incredibly influential in urban planning, urban development, who are not urban planners and urban developers, is that they can see the wood for the trees, like they can actually see what's going on, and they haven't necessarily been indoctrinated into the process. And so that's the shame about the urban planning system, is that it's very much about process. There's a lot of process that needs to be learned, and the professionals can get stuck on the process stuff and the design and learning the rules and arguing about the balustrading and forget that is that actually what makes a place great? Probably not. So.
And it's interesting, we were talking in the backstage just before we began about, I said that I'd learned about Jane Jacobs that she, one thing about her is that, she's not a professional, and she would go and, find blueprints of buildings and get her hands on plans and that sort of thing. And I guess base her research and her writings on that. And even just sort of having the realisation like, I suppose I can do that too, which, as Mimi rightly pointed out, is sort of a privilege in itself. Realising that you can access those things, and hopefully they're in the language that you speak, and they are actually accessible to you. But even that in itself is an amazing thing to me.
And I think that's what also Jane Jacobs did, is she spoke in such a plain language, which was incredibly accessible. I've been flipping through the old Death and Life the past couple of days, and it's really interesting how simply it's spoken, and it's a real rejection of, I guess, the sort of heavy theory that was coming out of the modernist kind of doctrine. It's interesting. And I'd go with you, Mimi, too, like people like Cedric Price and Archigram and all those guys that were looking at a city like a system as opposed to a standalone buildings. Really influential.
I am going to stick on Jane Jacobs for just one more point, I guess, because I'm not sure who in the audience is really familiar with Jane Jacobs' work and who isn't. So I thought maybe I could quickly talk about, she sort of famously argued, I guess, that to generate what she calls exuberant diversity in a city's streets and districts, which is something she was really passionate about, 4 conditions are indispensable. And I am kind of paraphrasing here, but in short, they are that 1, districts must serve more than one primary function, preferably more than 2, so that people who go outside on different schedules are kind of in the place for different purposes, but can all use many facilities in common. Number 2, that blocks should be short and opportunities to turn corners must be frequent. 3, districts must mingle buildings that vary in age and condition, including a good proportion of old buildings. And 4, that there must be a sufficiently dense concentration of people, including those who are there because they live there. So you'd think, that's pretty straightforward. You can see why Jacobs is well known for those points, which are, I suppose, intended to centre community, to centre people, which is sort of what we're talking about today. And I guess that's the reason I wanted to bring them up, because a lot of, self-made solutions, which we're talking about, intend to do this as well. And so I just wanted to ask of you 3, I guess, how much do those 4 so-called generators of diversity kind of feature, I guess, in your practice and your thinking, and maybe Mimi as well. How do you think they kind of hold up today in the context of where you live in LA? I'm interested in a lot of Jane Jacobs is sort of New York centric, so I'm interested in those comparisons.
Oh, defending LA. Los Angeles gets a lot of heat as, like, you can't walk in LA, there's no there, you have to drive everywhere. I live in Silver Lake, which has been voted, the hippest, seriously, the hippest neighborhood in the country. And it's I live there because it's a super walkable neighborhood. It's, yes, it has sort of a lot of the sort of structural elements that Jacobs talks about. It has short streets, although many of them are steep. It has a collection of old buildings and new buildings. But one of the things that is rapidly happening in the neighborhood that I think is something indicative of many neighborhoods in cities that are popular or sort of burgeoning, is that the diversity of people is changing. And so and this happened in Jane Jacobs' own neighborhood of the West Village in New York, is that the very things that are so desirable in those neighborhoods are actually driven out by their unpopularity because of the market rates that sort of drive it. And so Silver Lake in my neighborhood had been a mixed race, queer community with all sorts of kinds of people of income levels. And even in the few years that I've been there, I've seen rapid changes of who actually gets to live in the city, who can afford to live in this neighborhood, who is on the streets during what times a day. So I think it's, her work is so situated in its time, and to fast forward it opens up another whole can of worms about what our expectations are for cities today.
And what about you two?
The idea of old buildings is really interesting, I think, as well, and it gets maybe confused with ideas of heritage, when in actual fact I think it's about buildings being able to sort of be messy and robust and affordable, which is really important. And that's old buildings are such a kind of susceptible to being gentrified. But I think that's really a good point to sort of think about within those points, that it's this kind of, the robust fabric of a city that allows messiness and things to happen outside sort of traditional ideas of what should happen.
And I think as well the diversity elements that she speaks of, although I wouldn't say here are 4 rules, let's apply the rules, but I think, I've worked on many master plans where we applied the rules and, hey, it didn't turn out great either. But I think a lot of what the language she uses around those and what she's looking for by setting them out is about the evolution of cities. And that's particularly the point with old buildings is we don't think of them as something we build from here to here and then it's finished. Of course, cities don't finish. They keep going and they evolve. And so I think if you read the language behind the words she uses and the example she gives, it's about that evolution rather than a design brief that you start and finish.
I think she'd be surprised by places like Battery Park City, which was something that she was sort of fighting against in Lower Manhattan, which was a prime example of all of the sort of big modernist tropes that she would have hated, and actually has taken on a finer grain over time. So I think time is actually a really important thing to talk about as a part of the city and how things are reintegrated back into the city.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk as well about, what we mean when we say self-made city. I suppose I haven't really gotten into that. But I guess the various kinds of components that we're actually talking about when we say it. So I guess to move into that, I wanted to ask each of you, what does self-made or DIY architecture or urbanism mean to you as words or in the context of your work?
Well, I'm completely reliant on government clients, so our practice entirely works for Credit Victoria and Melbourne City Council primarily, as well as some self-initiated stuff. So I think, self-made is not sort of, in my mind, it's not DIY. It's much more of a collaborative kind of city-making process that's a kind of a big iterative project with the client and everyone and the public kind of all involved in a project that evolves. So that's kind of my take from our practice. But
Yeah, in our work at Co-Design, we talk a lot, we're in the placemaking space, which is just another buzz term that you love or don't love, depending who you are. But what we talk about a lot is the city-making industry focuses a lot on hardware, so the buildings and getting the building height right and the width of the street and the curve on the rail line, and of course that's important, the hardware is important, but if you don't also bring the software, which is the identity, the sense of place, the thing that actually makes you want to come back, places don't work. And so, in some ways the software is the last mile. It can be watered down to being the tokenistic art project on the side of a building, which may or may not actually give it some personality. But I think that, places that work, if you think of a place you love to be, it's not the place with the great paving pattern. It's the place where you like to, it's a comfortable weathered environment to sit and read a book, or it's got the great smiley waitresses who serve great coffee, or it's like the human side of the cities, and it's very easy for that side of city making to be left behind and to be forgotten and not to be part of the realm of urban planners. In some ways it overlaps more with economic development, but often that can totally rule it out too. And so for me, the self-made city is where that last mile, if you like, of city making, the occupation of the city in imprinting local personality onto place. And that might be through guerrilla gardening or community-led projects. It might be through collaborations, like with your great work and government organisations, but it's about that personality of the local people. And we all know it. If you think of a great place in Melbourne that you love, what kind of people you would expect to see there. You feel a connection to it. You know instinctively that Smith Street is different from Chapel Street. You can't necessarily explain how or why, but you know it. And I think, in my mind, that's the self-made city, is that personality speaks to everybody who goes there.
Is that dangerous though? Like thinking what kind of a community is in a particular area, I guess, or thinking about it I guess I'm just thinking of coming into a project. Do you sort of come in and go, we know the people who are in this area, or is it sort of like with every project you have to sort of reopen that and say, well, who is here, and has it changed in the last year, or who, and sort of I guess I'm thinking of the essence of time, kind of like what you were mentioning before, because those things change, I suppose.
I mean, I started looking at, I was calling it I didn't want to call it a particular name. So with the self-made city or self-initiated projects, DIY, ubiquitous, guerrilla, interventionist, like pop-up, like I wanted a whole spectrum of naming for these things because they come from so many different sort of ways of making. And I started looking at these kinds of practices in about 2009, 2010, when there was a big economic crisis going on in the US, and the kind of top-down projects weren't happening. And I was noticing a lot of young architects and designers stepping in to make stuff because they had all of this sort of resource of sort of time and no money, but a lot of brain power. And they were doing things like pop-up golf, mini golf, and projects like pools made out of dumpsters. And these things were really inspiring to me. What has been something I've been tracking over the time is that how those things become a little bit more policy-oriented, so that, say, a pop-up park is no longer the coming together of a community just to make a pop-up park, but it's an initiative within the city government that you sort of align yourself through, and then it helps sort of create a toolkit for how to make these things happen, but it also suggests that you who need sort of the, we were talking about the approvals process, right? That you need to be sanctioned in order to participate in your city. And I think that, again, back to sort of who gets to be sanctioned and how those things are sanctioned is really important to continue to question, if only to put some transparency on it.
You, let me throw a term out there that's sort of, I suppose, related to what we're talking about, tactical urbanism. I feel like there's been a lot of, even like, because that interventionist toolkit was 2011, was it? When it was
2010,
2011,
yeah.
sorry, yeah. And I feel like since then the conversation seems to just kind of be growing around that, and I feel like I've heard that particular terminology increasingly kind of in the last few years. How do you think this sort of, this, not just the term, but like the practice itself has sort of evolved in recent years, and, what are we seeing?
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
So they're looking at me because Co-Design Studio wrote the book, wrote the Australian and New Zealand case study book of tactical urbanism a couple of years ago. And so I'd love your answer on this too, Mimi, because you see it from a different perspective. But the movement has come out of the US, but actually the US is a very different kind of cultural environment when it comes to citizen action, citizen voice, community engagement. As communities, we're quite different. And so maybe 3 years ago, we embarked on looking at case studies of where grassroots groups, whether they be formal community organisations or just members of the public, get together to test out ideas in public to then create an advocacy movement around that idea to test whether it works or not, and then go to the decision makers and say, yes, let's put this park in because we've tested it, let's put this community garden in because we've tested it, let's put in a bike, formalise a bike lane because we've done a temporary one. And that's at the heart of tactical urbanism, is it's about testing an idea, getting a movement of people around it, looking at whether it works or not, and then using that as an advocacy tool to get approval. And what we discovered when we did the Australian and New Zealand version is that all of the projects that we were able to find were sanctioned by the local council, which meant that they had approval, which is great, but in the US and Latin American case studies, none of them are sanctioned. They're all guerrilla activities, and so they're used in a very different kind of way. But in Australia, we see through our work as well, not just the case studies, that the Australian public tend to sit back and wait for the council to do things, or call the council and ask them to do it, and aren't necessarily inclined to get started themselves. And if they do, they want to go through the formal approvals process, and we don't see a huge trend in the Australian community to actually just do it in the dead of night and not ask for approval. So it's a very different kind of environment here than it is in the States.
So this is funny, like our practice started doing this. We didn't know how to name. I actually thought it was tactile urbanism for a few seconds. But me and my partner, we took projectors out into the public. The first project we did, which was with Joe with guerrilla lighting, which was taking 100 dolphin energizer torches into Federation Square and just setting them up and illuminating that sort of the terrace. And that was an experiment. It was done through Light in Winter Festival, so it was kind of a guerrilla project attached to their official Light Festival. And we were fortunate enough to be engaged by Federation Square the next year and the subsequent 3 years to do that. So it was kind of, hearing you say that, it's really interesting. For us, it was actually about testing out the model for our practice. Same with a project called Projector Bike. We built a bike and just started taking it around, and since then we've worked for every council in Australia, and it's hilarious. And it all has kind of led to what we do now. So it's just a really funny thing. It's also, I think, really good for community to test what they're doing and ideas for their community. But it's also it was for us very much how we got gigs, how we started, and yeah.
I like that you sort of just told us the story behind the name Testing Grounds in a way as well.
Yeah, and just sort of on that as well, like I think following on from what you were saying about this kind of iterative approach, like you test something and then you allow the sort of information from that over a number of years to fold back into decision making. That is exactly what we're doing with all our projects, and that's why the relationship with the government client is really important, because we sit there with really close observation of what's going on day to day and feed that back. And hopefully it's our hope, it's our dear hope, that it really does influence the future of these sites that we occupy. We're kind of in a weird zone. It's not temporary, but it's not permanent. So it's kind of that 5-year zone of sort of hold pattern.
Yeah, I mean, this question of testing is so important, and I'm going to just keep harping on questions of time, and I'm going to keep sort of bringing back my own neighborhood as an example.
Please.
So a pilot project that was the first of the People Streets projects in Los Angeles, which was maybe the first or second city in the country to adopt a pop-up park or plaza approach, closed off this sort of little street in Silver Lake and created this plaza, which was done basically with paint and some street furniture. And it created this polka dot little triangle, which is where they have a farmer's market a couple times a week. And when it was in full swing, and it was at the very beginning of the project, the cafes and restaurants around it would maintain the furniture and maintain the space. What has since happened with the kind of economic change going on in the neighborhood is that the original actors who were maintaining those chairs and umbrellas and plantings have gone away. So like the cafe, which was really sort of the community hub, was basically their rents went up and they couldn't stay. And in the time that it's been there, it's been about 6 or 8 months since that happened, the place has actually kind of gotten gross. Like, and it's really sad to see, because the whole sort of idea of these little chairs sort of entering into the dialogue, and that the fact that there was a caretaking around it within the folks in the neighborhood has dissolved. And so what it has become is sort of a place for itinerant people to come and hang out, and there's sort of now sort of, and maybe this is like a Chantal Mouffe sort of the agonism of the commons, right? Like there's now sort of the chairs get stolen, there's fights at the markets about who gets which chair, there's not enough chairs for people. These kinds of things start to happen. And so testing is really important. So like we tested this thing, like, and now maybe it's time for another test to happen.
I was going to save this to the end, I guess, to end on a note of, okay, well, what do we do? What's the future of these projects, I guess? Because a lot of the time, tactical urbanism and temporary solutions, sort of at the inception phase or conception phase of a project, but it's almost like, do you need them sort of the whole way through a life of a project? You need to test sort of constantly almost. Yeah.
Or when do they, when do you want to demand more than a pop-up park? And for a community really requires a larger green space.
Yeah. And ongoing care and resources and everything.
And in fact, I think pop-up parks and that sort of, that material quality is quite familiar now, to the point where it's actually used, and we jokingly sort of call it like the Trojan horse, like other things are actually being bundled up inside the pallets and kind of, and they're maybe things that councils want to initiate, so they're council-led, or they're sort of, this this aesthetic of pop-up is actually used for political reasons, to deliver messages, for really sort of direct community consultation. It's maybe not always a neutral or a community-led thing anymore, which is quite interesting that it's become so common now that it's used for that reason.
This talk is flying by. I'm just looking at the clock and we're about halfway through. And I do want to make sure that I get one question in. I know we're supposed to be talking about cities, but I was just thinking, about who gets left out of the conversation, that sort of thing. I know this talk is called The Self-Made City, but I want to ask about the suburbs as well in relation to this. Yes, the theme of the self-made. I think sort of Australia and Melbourne in particular has a funny relationship with its suburbs. Even Jane Jacobs railed against a particular kind of suburbia, and I guess with Jane as the sort of underlying theme today, I want to ask, in taking on some of these ideas, do we risk ignoring the areas where in many major cities, Melbourne included, that's where the majority of people live. Like, how do we sort of connect these two conversations? Like, do we need self-made suburbs as well? And how is this sort of going out there?
I'll start. I think the challenge with our suburbs, there's two ways to look at it, or there's two things at play. One of the problems or challenges with our suburbs is that many of the places that spring to mind when we say the problems with our suburbs are all new. And so they're all built at once, they've got the design rules out, and they build them, they deliver them, they do the formula of the community centre and this much green space, and it gets delivered over time, and there might be a place branding approach that this is the lake community and this is the eucalyptus community, and this, there's a branding approach to it. And that's problematic. New communities moving in, then there's not any social capital yet. And again, not much thought is often given to how that's built over time, particularly when people leave during the day to drive into the city to go to work. And so, there's a lot of work being done to try and make places better from the beginning, and the Victorian government has led some of that, with varying levels of success. But we know that that's a problem, and we're working with a local government here in Victoria that is all greenfield, all growth area suburb, and they've now connected the state of their suburbs, the new developments that are being built, as being the leading cause of domestic violence in that municipality. And they have the highest rate of domestic violence in Australia. And so the CEO of that local government realises that putting people in that beautiful houses with pools and stuff, nice parks and all that, but they're lonely, people are disconnected, and this is significant issues facing Australian communities, and it's much, much worse in our suburbs too. And, loneliness is now a bigger killer than smoking and alcohol abuse in Australia. 1 in 3 Australians don't know any neighbour, in their whole local area. So, people aren't held accountable. That's where the domestic violence comes in, and all sorts of challenges there. And so, what I would say is the approach of put in a community centre or things like that only has limited relevance, I would say. And some of the work I'm now doing with my data analytics platform is where looking at particularly new suburbs that you look on the outside and it looks like there's no shops, there's nothing that would be happening there, but we can find on social media and other online forums that there are actually mothers club groups and craft afternoon events, and the school, although the school's over there, they have things down at the local park, and there is actually a hidden vibrancy to these places that's very easy to overlook when you're just looking at counting the number of community centres. So I think there's hope, but it's hard, it's easy to miss what's really going on out there.
LA has endless rings of suburbs, and so there's various old ones, and we can sort of track out. But I think of places like the San Gabriel Valley, which is a primarily Chinese suburb. It's got these incredibly big strip malls, like strip malls on steroids. And every time I had gone out there, because you go out there because you want to get like the best dim sum or something, like there's really great reasons to go. And our food writer in LA, Jonathan Gold, is always saying, like, you have to go try this place in like the San Gabriel Valley. And so you go. And it seems really foreign in the sense that architecturally it's everything that you would hate. It's like a 3-story strip mall around a parking lot. And then I went to Shenzhen. And then I realized that this is actually a typology that's Chinese. Like what I was reading culturally as like the kind of development of like a US strip mall gone haywire, and that this is maybe something pathological, is actually something culturally that is quite common in new Chinese cities. And so I think we also have to be careful about the value systems that we bring to different kinds of urbanisms, because...
And the rules.
Yeah, the rules, right? This is a different rule set. Like, this is a rule set that says we come to a strip mall as a public space and a place of exchange, and that the way that, we get there is we drive, because, we live in a sort of a more sprawled suburb, and we need a place to park, and then we do all these things here, and that this is very much like how certain parts of China operate, and that, given that my understanding of China is really one city. I shouldn't speak for all of it, but the kind of parallels of experience between this one place and this other place were so strong that I can't help but and they both had this suburban character to them.
Yeah. Has that revelation kind of changed your experience when you do go there to eat or anything else?
Yeah, because I go like this is not me sort of, I'm not slumming, but like I'm not being ironic anymore in going to this. Like, it's not like, oh, let's go play in like the valley and like the strip malls. Like, it's actually its own sort of cultural phenomenon that takes on built form.
I grew up in the city, sort of like right up this end of Fitzroy, and I think the suburbs are awesome. I love them. And I like that each suburb of Melbourne has a different character and a different personality, and you get different types of food and different types of cultures in different places. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it'd be a shame to try and take qualities of a busy city and sort of imprint that on suburban life. I think there's something really, something delightful about the suburbs.
Mimi, I wanted to ask you, I guess, all of you actually, but Mimi because she literally wrote a book called Tiny Houses in the City, about tiny houses and where they fit into this. I feel like, we are often inundated kind of with tiny house discourse, I guess because it is that sort of design media friendly story. But I'm interested to know, your thoughts on where they really do fit into the picture here in terms of people, determining their own living environment and. Yeah.
I think we can go two directions with that. I think tiny houses in the city have a way of finding sites that wouldn't necessarily seem buildable and then taking advantage of that, which means that the sort of infill housing means that a city that can sort of accommodate more people in different kinds of ways. But then there's also the story of LA that we have 57,000 people who are homeless in the in the county of Los Angeles. It's a figure I'll probably say tomorrow on the Living Cities panel as well. It's this enormous number of people. And a couple years ago, a guy named Elvis Summers took the initiative to build tiny houses. He did about 24 tiny houses for homeless people. And he gave them to them, and then the city came and took them away because claiming that they were dangerous. They were these wooden boxes. They were basically didn't have the sort of amenities that these people needed. Now, the one thing that these tiny houses did have was a lock on the front door, so that if you were homeless, you could have somewhere and you could put your stuff, and no one could get to it. And so. I think tiny houses can fit in both as a way of sort of finding your space within sort of being a homeowner, but also as a way of finding some security. I don't necessarily think that the giving tiny houses to the homeless is the best solution for the homeless problem, but in places like Oregon and Washington, there have been sort of groups of coalitions of formerly homeless people who have come together to build tiny house communities where the city government will give land and then set some conditions for health and wellness, so that these a dozen or two houses can go up, and so that there is temporary housing for people that is around a central green space and has community facilities and bathing facilities and all of that. And I think those are really positive ways of looking at how tiny houses can begin to impact the urban environment.
Absolutely.
Anyone else on tiny?
No, it's all right.
I think it's
If
good
not,
that
that's
people
fine.
can, like, obviously we've got really kind of crazy housing prices in Australia, and I think it's just great that there's an idea that you can build something and live in it and afford it, and it's kind of quite democratic.
Yeah, but what's just questions like, can you do accessory dwelling units here, like granny flats? Is that something that's encouraged?
Yeah, in some suburbs, yeah. And I think it's also good to be able to make, like, if you have a plot of land, to be able to sort of, sell a part of it, to part of a family member, or, you know what I mean? There's different ways of living on land and parcels.
It seems like almost an older way of sort of integrating back to this question of loneliness in the suburbs,
Yeah.
where allowing for sort of multiple families to live
Exactly.
on, or multiple generations to live on one plot of land.
Got to do something with all those baby boomers.
Before we finish up, I guess maybe in the spirit of Jane Jacobs, but also, the self-made city in general, we're talking a lot about, built environment that has people in mind, that is for citizens, and that is for everyone, I guess. And if we're talking about the self-made city, this conversation, it can't just be for planners, it can't just be for architects. It has to be for everybody, from all different walks of life, not just occupations. But I wanted to ask each of you, do you think, I guess in your various lines of work, do you think there's a responsibility to be an activist in some sense for the social issues surrounding what you do? A la Jane Jacobs.
Well, okay. So the way the work that we do works is that we design things. We don't sort of call them architecture. We think about it more as infrastructure, and the reason for that is that it's sort of, we think there's value in provisioning a kind of a baseline kit of parts, essentially, almost, and it's our hope that sort of gives over agency to people. Often the project testing grounds I'm talking about is for creative practice, so a lot of artists can then do things with that. So that's the way we sort of respond to that, and really sort of rally against kind of big buildings, and instead thinking about things that give the public agency, and particularly artists. So that's really important for us.
I think, I feel personally disappointed in myself that it took me so long to become one, and I really do. And I think that city makers, whatever profession that is, have a responsibility to critically analyse the way we work and critically think about whether we're just doing it for the sake of that's the rule, or whether there's better ways to be doing things. And I think that's not done enough. And I think that it's the responsibility of every professional to be doing that with their work. And I think the other part of that, perhaps being an activist, is being able to speak to every person. And urban development sector tend to like being experts and pat themselves on the back for their own expertness, and aren't great at actually speaking to the public about stuff. And I think the Melbourne conversations, the fact that there's a full room here tonight, and Melbourne Knowledge Week and all the incredible events that happen there, we have much more sophisticated conversations with the room full of the public than I ever have at conferences when I speak about things where we're just talking about everyone's projects, And so I think that's something that the urban development sector have a responsibility to do, but we actually learn a lot from, is learning to speak to the public like Jane Jacobs did. Yeah.
And as a journalist and critic, I see myself as an ally to activist practices, so that I can be a platform or a mouthpiece for highlighting projects that I think are sort of moving in the right direction, that are sort of making some change or sort of speaking to something. I call myself an instigator, so...
Did I say that in your introduction? I can't remember. I should have.
But I think in that sense, my role as a voice in the profession is to try to sort of put forward works that I see as interesting, and trying to sort of make change. Now, does that mean that they all work, or no? Like there's things that fail, there's things that maybe are a little bit more pipe dream, but I think there's been a lot of conversation with this very sort of narrow disciplinary architecture profession sort of thing, but there's been a lot of talk within architecture about whether or not architecture can be political. And I guess I would advocate that architecture is inherently political, and my role is to continue to sort of beat that drum for an engagement in the politics of architecture.
Absolutely. And I've told you this before, Mimi, but one of my favourite opinion pieces of yours is from, I think, 3 years ago on Dezeen, where you asked the question, why have architects and designers sort of been so traditionally quiet over certain issues? And in that column, you're specifically referring to, I think it was 2014, wasn't it? And you're specifically referring to Ferguson and other, recent clashes over race and police violence in our urban settings. And I think it's an important kind of point in that context. And yeah, sort of, why is there a trend for this particular industry to be a little timid in these matters?
Speaking for all architects, I do want to say that after I did that piece, I got emails from various groups of people who were starting to put together readings or activities or exhibitions that were sort of dealing with these issues. And so I think instigating an idea, it wasn't originally my idea, but that being able to then call a rallying cry for like more people to work in this space is really important. The blunt reason why architects don't get so involved is economic. It is a historically very difficult sort of space to occupy as an architect when you work for a client and the client pays your bills, and the politics of the client often become your own politics. And I think that is the hardest thing for, Zaha Hadid architects, got famously sort of beat up around these questions of what in building for the World Cup are you taking on the politics of the country that's in, and they would argue no, but I think these questions are really at the core of it is, where do you draw your line? Do you build a prison or not? Like these things are all about sort of the economics of how your practice is built, and architecture is a fairly conservative practice.
But I'm also, like, design and architecture schools are sort of really radical, I think, and have been for a long time. A lot of really amazing sort of ideas have come out of an education discourse where there's no client. So it's really evident that that's when ideas are allowed to be sort of, or to push comfort zones, I guess, which is really interesting. And I think I saw on Instagram or something, I think it was out of Columbia University in New York, it said, we won't build your wall up like in all the windows of...
I think it was a number of the universities that were...
was that?
Yeah, I think Yale, Columbia...
They all did it, just things like that
one.
Yeah, just having a voice and not being afraid of sort of,
And it's sort of, I guess, bringing it back to talking about temporary interventions and that sort of thing and tactical urbanism. It's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be... the project doesn't have to be political in itself, but if you're facilitating a space where people can be political or can, are free to express themselves, then that in itself is good.
That's just to follow on quickly. That's what we say with our projects. We're like literally holding back just forces in a way. That's what we sort of see our role as, is almost just maintaining a clearing for things to happen, and it's trickier to do than it might sound. But it's good.
Well,
important, though. Pardon? Important.
Yeah. It's like
the clock's just started ticking at me, which I think means that it's time to take questions. We have about 10 minutes. If any members of the audience would like to ask any questions of Mimi, Jessica and Millie, I think there is a microphone going around, so just raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and don't be shy.
When the connection between the self-made city and appreciating what you've already got exists. Like in Melbourne, the Lord Mayor wants to tear down the Victoria Market, the Windsor Hotel, and all these 19th century buildings are sort of empty above the ground level. I mean, how can we use what we've got and self-make that into what we've got?
Anybody in particular like to take that question?
I would say that the trouble there is what I was talking about before, is that the urban development sector is set up as that project needs to start and then we create it and then it's finished, and not a very sophisticated way of thinking about how a place can evolve. And the examples you've given are really valuable examples and important examples, and equally there are other places that should be thought about as places that can evolve over time too. You know, I live in Footscray, amazing warehouses, and that some of them are ugly, but they're great spaces that are now becoming maker spaces and other things, and that happens because currently there's no economic pressure for them to be redeveloped, but I don't hold out much hope in them sticking around. So I think until we can start to think of the city-making process as something that we foster to evolve over time and not just a series of projects, I fear that, you know, that's why there's pressure on buildings like the Queen Vic Markets and others, is because there's a government decision to fix it, so there's a project that goes along with that which starts and finishes, and I think that's part of the problem.
And that's kind of where the rules are good in a way. Like, I'm just thinking about the one about keeping old buildings. Like, there's many different diversities that are important, I guess.
And old buildings are valuable not only because they're old and because they tell a story of the past and because it's important to keep it, you know, an eye on where we came from and how things evolve, but also because they are diverse and they're interesting and they have personality and they have stories in them and people have attachment to them. And so there are many places that aren't historic on the historic register that also have those other attributes too. And when we think about, you know, when we just say, well, let's preserve the heritage buildings or let's put that on the heritage register, we miss the conversation about the other cultural values that people put on places too, which is a shame. It can be relegated to, is it heritage or not? Well, it's not, let's knock it down, which is a shame.
Hi, my question has to do with the spaces more than buildings for self-made cities, verges, unused spaces. Particularly, I'm interested in how you basically bring along with the growth of the city, the people that are getting sidelined, the homeless, people who maybe have difficulty affording food and stuff. So using verges as gardens and using abandoned spaces for tiny house villages and stuff. But how do you bring those groups along and also keep it properly permitted so that it is safe for everybody and involves everyone? And how do you blend the two to keep it with the government and that it's managed the way it needs to be, but that you are including everybody?
Who wants to take this question?
I mean, I'm giving it a little bit of a think, and of course I have a Los Angeles answer. But again, it comes down to sort of temporary uses. So within the city of LA, there's been a bunch of exploration around how to deal with the homeless population, and some of the answers are like, okay, what if we set up areas for overnight parking that has that has like a restroom facility and like running water, right? And so that is a temporary use within this context, which allows people to sort of hold space in a way, but it is also sort of monitored by the municipal government at the same time. So rather than just having people with their RVs sort of camping on any streets, you have sort of designated areas for it that can have policing and sort of lighting and things like that. So it's strategy versus tactics, I think, in some of that. It's like looking carefully within sort of the code conditions to try to find the places of mutability and then bring the two groups together. So it's not just top down, bottom up, but it's about sort of these expansive areas.
Well, I was just also thinking all land belongs or is someone's responsibility. So from our experience, it's always about close collaboration with the person or the organisation who's responsible for it. I know it's really interesting in Melbourne, some of the big landholders are VicTrack and Melbourne Water because of infrastructure needs of the city, and they're really progressive in the way that they think about using these sort of large areas they've got, and they're in sort of regional centres, but they're also in urban areas as well. So I think there's a lot of thinking happening with organisations about what to do with these pockets and leftover spaces. Slowly though.
Sorry. At Co-Design Studio, we're inspired by the amount of land that Melbourne Water Control and VicTrack and others, we're running a program called the Neighbourhood Project, which you can find at neighbourhoodproject.org, which is trying to tackle exactly this. So it's a practical program to make community-led projects easier. And so we've just finished round one, where we worked with Whitehorse Council, Cardinia Shire and Hobsons Bay, and we helped those local governments go into their own communities and work with their citizens to look for latent opportunity for these sorts of projects, specifically around underutilised land, and then help those projects happen. They had to be community driven, which is tricky when the council's going in and saying, hey, who wants to do a community-led project, when the council's asking the question. So there's a challenge there. But what we found with the monitoring and evaluation there, and we're putting everything online as we speak, so if you're interested, follow along through the website. But we found that the surveys at the beginning, looking at why these projects weren't happening in communities that ended up pulling off the quite incredible work, was that they didn't know they were allowed, they could, and they didn't know enough people in their local neighbourhood. And so we found that it really became a social capital piece. So the councils had been willing the whole time, and if you say, why, how do we get more of it happening? I think we need to get neighbours talking to one another and say, give them permission to have a go. And then, we're finding that the policies and the permits actually just follow along quite easy. Insurance is a bit more difficult, but we're hoping to solve that. But it's actually the social capital existing in those places, and so having a barbecue to get everyone to start talking in that local place has been actually an incredibly simple catalyst to make really cool projects happen.
That's interesting, because I think about the work of Damon Rich in Newark, and he doesn't go in to do a project unless there's already a project starting to brew around as a community group, because in Newark there's a lot of sort of community agency, but there's no way of filtering that back up into the government. So the bottom up is very rich, the bottom is very rich, but the top is not hearing it. And so he looks for places where sort of conversations are already starting, and then builds out from there.
I think we've got time for one more.
I was specifically wanting to ask Jessica this one. Have you heard of Christie's Place?
Yes.
That is talk about community, and it started off guerrilla.
Yes.
And it got community together. And I've also been out in Daylesford, in that part of the world, and there are areas there that are setting up as multi-age community, sustainable communities that utilise land, and it's a whole blend of community. That really makes me excited, because I think that's what is missing when people are not connected with their neighbours, as you say, loneliness.
Yeah.
If you knew that your older neighbour was needing some help, you of course you'd do it. But because the way our communities are designed, you've got these gates that you press a button and it's so much of a block, a wall around the place.
Yes.
Whereas this community, the way they're designed is all cars are outside, and then you have the houses like a corral, like a wagon train,
Mm-hmm.
and then the internal part is land that people couldn't afford by themselves, but they can utilise as a community inclusively. I'd love to see more of that sort of thing. I'd also love to see some trees on tops of buildings and solar panels and stuff out here. But that sort of feel, that sort of community action, which is brings connection. That's what I'd love to see. Yeah.
I think, and you've made some really excellent points there about, the value of public space and the importance of it, and don't lock it all away in the backyard. People aren't using their backyards anymore, and you're looking at communal spaces. It reminds me that we just ran a program up in Queensland asking young people in southeast Queensland about what sort of lifestyle they wanted to have in their future, and that this exact issue came up, is about shared communal spaces, knowing their neighbours, without, I swear, swear, hand on heart, without any prompting from me, the top thing that these 100 young people came up with is the most important thing facing Brisbane and Southeast Queensland in the next 50 years is people knowing their neighbours. You know, it gives me goosebumps to say that. You know, they get it. They get that that's important, and they don't drive cars yet. They don't, you know, and so they know the importance of that local community. And we talked about the trade-offs there and about the issues of traditional neighbourhoods now being built with very high fences and security concerns and all these rules about not overlooking windows, and windows have to be frosted and all this sort of things. And they, across the board, in many different groups, came up with solutions that were about, they said they would be much happier to trade off privacy for this communal neighbourhood feel, so people know one another. So, you know, I hope if we don't beat those opinions out of them before they get into positions of where they're town planners and councillors and things, I hope that there's a change coming with that.
Well, that might be a nice note to end this on. That is all that we have time for tonight. I want to say a really big thank you to Open House Melbourne for facilitating this talk, and the Wheeler Centre, of course, as well, and Mimi, Jessica and Millie. Can I please get a round of applause for our three speakers?
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.